From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Conflict has plagued parts of the Middle East for decades. But ever since two of the region's biggest players, also geopolitical rivals Iran and Saudi Arabia, re-established diplomatic relations in March, the tide seems to be shifting towards diplomacy. First of all, Aksan Kaveni reports from Tehran, Iran.
Since the beginning of the year, the Middle East has witnessed one of its fastest political developments in recent times. The rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia has dominated Middle East politics in recent years, engulfing Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen. But now the Middle East and even North Africa are gearing up for the possibility of seismic political change. 2022 and 2023 have seen renewed engagement between the Persian Gulf states and Iran. This year's talks, brokered by China, saw Iran and Saudi Arabia re-establish diplomatic ties for the first time since 2016. It comes after the UAE re-established relations with the Islamic Republic last August. Analysts suggest these developments are likely to increase the chances for a political settlement in Yemen. The range of positive political developments have gone beyond the Persian Gulf region, as we see Egypt and Jordan have sent friendly signals to Tehran. Analysts believe the recent Iran-Saudi deal could promote stability in the entire Arab world. By the official reopening of the embassies in Tehran and Riyadh expected to take place in the coming days, and also President Ebrahim Raisi's upcoming trip to Saudi Arabia, more tangible regional outcome is expected to be seen. Ehsan Keivani, CGTN, Tehran.
Now, for more discussions, joining me at this hour in Tel Aviv, Israel, we have John Gong, Vice President of Research and Strategy at the University of International Business and Economics. We also have Joshua Landis, Chair Professor and Director of the University of Oklahoma's Center for Middle East Studies, and Bobby Naderi in London, England. He is a journalist and political commentator. Welcome to all of you, gentlemen. Let me start with you, Professor John Gong. Arab states seems to be normalizing ties with Damascus after years of regional isolation. It was the UAE and Bahrain first in 2018, and later on some countries seems to be jumping on the bandwagon, and now Saudi Arabia is in talks with Damascus. What do you think is driving this round of shift in approach?
Well, I think a lot has to do with the changing political climate in the Middle East. I think after years of warring, that takes a toll on several countries. I think people are tired of this, and I think people see that the rapprochement, what I would describe as the great rapprochement among the big powers, the regional powers, Saudi and Iran, it's really taking place. And I think there's a benefit towards, both countries, both sides, both camps, but also, from an economic point of view, I think a secure and peaceful environment works well for every player. And also this has a lot to do with, in my view, the winning influence of the United States, particularly the relation between Saudi and Washington, the United States. I think it's clearly it's a little bit of a strained relationship, and in light of all of these developments, I think naturally these two regional powers are coming to peace. And reportedly, this has been going on. I mean, the negotiation between Saudi and Iran has been going on for some time. And certainly they cut the ribbon in Beijing, which is something very nice. Certainly it means that China played a quite important role in this negotiation. Now the natural effect of the relationship between Saudi and Iran is coming to Syria now. So I think it's interesting, and also it's a good thing to see that finally there's going to be peace in Syria, and Syria is coming back to the fold of the Arab world.
Yeah, Bobby in London, England, what do you make of this round of regional rapprochement, especially the ones between the Arab states and Damascus, Syria? Was it, in your opinion, because of the strengthening of power, the power base of President Bashar al-Assad, as is a consolidating control over much of his country, or is it because of the recent earthquake or the China brokered deal between Tehran and Riyadh? What do you think?
It's an amalgamation of all of these factors, and of course, the fact that America is no longer in the Middle East. America has left the Middle East to its own devices. This is a new world order. And many Arab allies of the United States have come to their senses that in this, they are not going to have the battle with the United States anymore. Because why? America has its own problems, many problems, domestically and internationally. America doesn't have influence anymore. The influence goes to countries like China, which are only going for diplomacy, cooperation, and that's precisely what China is trying to do. China is trying to build what America's war on terror destroyed in the Middle East, especially in Syria. We know that the regime change failed to replace the government of Bashar al-Assad. We know that the country wants to rebuild itself. We know that Arab allies want to normalize ties with Damascus. We also know that it is all because of the normalization of ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia that was backed and brokered by China. So until yesterday, America was against this normalization, even against the reconstruction, the idea of reconstructing Syria. But surprise, surprise, since yesterday, they have welcomed this initiative, which means that they are secretly backing what China wants to do in the Middle East, which is bringing all these hostile nations together, sort out their differences through dialogue, and start the reconstruction process, not just in Syria, but also in countries like Yemen and Afghanistan.
Right. Talking about the role or the lack of it from Washington, Professor Landis, let me turn to you. Is the shift in diplomatic approach in the Middle East also indicative of a growing Middle Eastern distrust of Washington, which has traditionally been the dominant external player in the region?
Absolutely. Saudi Arabia, the kingpin of U.S. in the Middle East, and particularly the Persian Gulf, does not trust the United States the way it used to. We see this most importantly in the rising tensions between Iran and Israel. And Saudi Arabia is very worried that Israel might bomb Iran as it continues to refine nuclear capacity. And because of that, it looks to the United States to protect it. The United States is the big weapons supplier to the Gulf. But only several years ago, President Trump, when Iran attacked a Al-Assad refinery, stopping almost half of the refining capacity of Saudi Arabia looked to the United States to bomb Iran or to do something. The United States said, no, we're not. You can buy some of our missiles. And Saudi Arabia became very upset by this. And I think this was the door that opened for China, because Saudi Arabia today realizes America's not going to be able to protect us. We have to look after our own interests. We need peace with Iran. Because Saudi Arabia today wants to be like the UAE. It wants to be a trading power. It's opening up. It wants stability. And stability is the key. And if Israel bombs Iran, Iran might attack Saudi Arabia because it's the weak link in the Persian Gulf. And Saudi Arabia does not want this. And it's looking to China, which has good relations. And China has supplanted the United States. It's the biggest trading partner with China. It takes the most of Saudi oil. So it's no longer the United States, which is the leading power in the region economically. It remains the leading power militarily, but not economically. And so more and more states are looking to China's good offices to help sort out some of this conflict.
Professor Landis, you talk about the dynamics or the symbiotic relations between the economic ties and the military and strategic ties between China and the Gulf states in particular and the Arab states in general. To what extent do you think growing trade and investment relations between China and the Arab states can further translate into further consolidation of political and geopolitical relations, interactions between the two?
Oh, I think it's moving in that direction, and more regional countries are choosing China. If you take the UAE, for example, United Arab Emirates, Huawei, the big telephone company, has built the infrastructure in the UAE. The United States, which was supposed to sell F-35s, the most advanced military fighters, because of the Abrahamic Accords, to the UAE, doesn't really want to sell them now because they're worried. They don't want Arab countries to use the Chinese framework for telecommunications. They're worried about spying and so forth. So they're making countries choose. Jordan just chose a European supplier of telephones, but the UAE has this Chinese infrastructure, and increasingly Saudi Arabia is turning to China even for missile technology. So increasingly, it's not just the economic ties, but that's turning into military ties as well, because they don't want to be just tied to the United States. They don't want to be totally dependent on the United States, because the United States is sanctioning one country after the next, and they're frightened. And President Biden has framed this Middle East conflict, the Ukrainian conflict, as democracies versus autocracies. And of course, all the Middle Eastern countries are looking to a China model. They want to retain political stability, and they don't want to give up their political power. And so they're worried that eventually this could lead to the United States sanctioning them. And so they want to cover their bets and have reinsurance. And China is, of course, the leading power coming up in the world that can give them that reinsurance.
Well, very interesting. Thanks for these analysis. Professor John Gong, talking about the role of China, could the regional rapprochement in the Middle East that we're seeing right now be seen as a domino effect of China brokered deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which in turn paves the way for improved relations with Syria?
Well, I think it can be portrayed that way, but I think in substance there's an underlying fundamentals going on that's pretty very well explained by my previous panelists. The fundamental, I think, these countries are tired of this continuous wars, continuous bickerings and fighting, and they're looking for peace, and they're looking for peace in a way that's not going to be hijacked or held hostage by another great power. I think Landis mentioned the impact of the war in Ukraine and the way it was framed by Washington. And I think this sends a chill down the spine of a lot of these political leaders in the Middle East, right? I mean, it's if Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine is framed as a big battle between so-called liberal order versus the authoritarian regimes, all these countries, how can they be classified, categorized into the former camp, right? So I think against this backdrop, these countries are taking these actions, I think not just from a geostrategic or geopolitical perspective, they're also worried about what's their position in the ideological framework of the United States and the West, the collective West in general. So I think there's also another very important political motivation here that the Washington is not something fundamentally reliable because of these differences, and these differences are not going to go away. So I think China's approach is very different. We set aside our political differences. We want to maintain peace and also cooperative relationships. We try to seek economic and business opportunities for the mutual benefits. I think this is a much attractive model to the Middle East political leaders.
Yeah, some would say that there's finally some recognition or long overdue recognition of the Chinese approach towards diplomacy and external relations around the world. Now, Bobby, with the ongoing efforts to improve relations with Damascus, do you believe that the Arab countries will agree on whether to invite President Bashar al-Assad, to the upcoming Arab League summit in May?
Absolutely, there is no doubt about it. Yes, there are some differences. I am sure that they have their differences, but to start reconstruction, they have made some promises. They have committed themselves to help rebuild Saudi Arabia through investment, through political support. We know that they don't have much expertise in building roads and bridges like what China has done through its Belt and Road Initiative. But at the end of the day, they have all voiced their support for the return of the Syrian government to the Arab League. That is going to happen, definitely. Maybe not this time around, but definitely it is going to happen because the consensus is there. The agreement has already been made behind closed doors with the support of China and Iran and Saudi Arabia. So don't doubt about it that when I say the Arab League nations are going to help rebuild Syria, that is precisely going to be the case. By the way, when the Saudi refineries was attacked with missiles, remember what was the America's reaction? It said, I am willing to send you more missiles. Washington didn't offer help to rebuild that refinery. It said, I'm going to send you missiles, which means I want to help you wage wars, continue the destruction, continue this, forever war of attrition. But that's why the trust is no longer there. These Arab countries don't want war. They don't want their facilities to be destroyed by another missile attack or another protracted war. They want to rebuild. They want to rebuild their neighbors, and they want to have a prosperous relationship, not just with themselves, but also with former hostile neighbors like Syria and Iran. That's precisely what they are doing. Syria is going back to the Arab League. The Arab League nations are going to help politically and financially offer any kind of support to help rebuild Syria. And at the same time, China, Iran, and Saudi Arabia are definitely going to help rebuild this war-torn country. That is going to be the case in the coming future, not very distant, but very soon.
Well, Bobby, you talk about the assumption that there have been rounds of behind the door or behind the scene negotiations among all sides, trying to take Syria back into the Arab League. How did you reach that understanding?
America is not there anymore. The Saudi Arabia, they have already opened their embassies in Iran and Saudi Arabia. This is a done deal. This is a done deal. All the Iranian officials have had these meetings have been going on for at least 2 years, not just in China that we had this successful agreement, but in Iraq and Oman. Those countries are the ones that agreed to return Syria to the Arab League. That's why the UAE invited the Syrian president to Dubai to have talks. They have already made the agreements. It's a done deal. I know there are some differences, and it is going to take some time in order to broadcast it, but they have already done that. Syria is going back to the Arab League because they have already made the agreements. They have already invited the Syrian president to the UAE, and he is going to visit other countries as well, including Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, that really sounds very promising. We do need more rapprochement instead of more conflicts, more ammunition and weapon sales. But what do you think of Qatar, who has been opposing, somewhat opposing a rapprochement with Syria? Bobby?
No, I don't. Qatar is an ally of Iran and Turkey. Maybe it is a little bit under pressure from the Erdogan government. That is why they haven't made up their minds yet. But remember, Qatar is a strategic partner of Iran when it comes to gas and oil exports. They are supporting each other. When Qatar was under sanctions by Saudi Arabia, it was Iran and Turkey that helped the Qatari government. But now if there are some misunderstanding and differences, that's because there are still some forces in Syria that are being backed by Turkey and Qatar. And that is the problem, because we know that parts of Syria is still under occupation. We know that American forces are there. These are the problems that are going to continue for some time. So when the reconstruction starts, it is not going to cover the whole country. It is going to only cover the parts of the country that is controlled and managed by the Syrian government. So even though the reconstruction will start and these places will be rebuilt, but we will still have some occupied areas like those in the north of the country that is under the control of the American forces, the Qatari and Turkish backed forces. That is why Qatar is still not, certain about any kind of normalization.
You're talking about the role of Washington, Bobby.
Make no mistake, that is going to happen because Qatar is under pressure from Iran as well.
Right. Talking about the role of Washington, I want you gentlemen to listen to this. A spokesperson from Washington. Listen.
Our stance against normalization remains unchanged. We will not normalize with the Assad regime. We have been clear about this, and we've been quite clear about this with our partners.
Professor Landis, this was from a spokesperson in the U.S. State Department. What do you make about Washington's views towards the situation?
Well, the United States still occupies about a third of Syria and has the Kurds as a proxy military. So they have a lot of leverage in the United States, and they have sanctions on Syria. And so even once the Arab countries return Syria to the Arab fold, it's going to be very difficult for them to move in any big way and do business in Syria to rebuild, which is one of the stumbling blocks. So the United States has a lot of leverage. Barbara Leaf, the Undersecretary of State, said only recently, if the Arabs are going to normalize with Syria, I hope they get something for it. So there's been a lot of negotiation between the Arab states, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Syria on what can you give us for normalization. And they want three things. They want to stop the drug trade. They want a political solution so that the opposition don't get chased out of the country in the north. And they want Iran to play a smaller role in Syria. And Assad is standing firm on all those except for the drug trade. He does not want to make major concessions. So this has put the Middle East in a rather difficult position. They want Syria back in, but they do want concessions from Assad. And so the United States is pushing them to get the most concessions and is still holding its nose on Syria. But this whole process leaves the United States increasingly more isolated, because as normalization goes forward, and it's going to go forward, they may not be readmitted to the Arab League this time, but they will be next time, as our fellow commentator said. And the United States is going to have less and less authority in the region unless it gets a seat at the table and begins negotiating as well.
But Professor Landis, what do you think Washington and Joe Biden's administration might do next, given the rapprochement, the détente that we've seen between once conflicting parties in the region?
Well, the United States, I think, is asking Qatar not to recognize this, and is asking fellow countries to push for real noticeable changes in Syria's foreign policy and its attitude towards the opposition. Now, the United States has Syrian oil. It has, and we've seen this tanker war going on between Iran and the United States in a sense. So the two are still arm wrestling over control. The president of Iran flew to Syria just this week and has been visiting Syria in a very televised, very forward-looking visit, and he has been congratulating Assad for winning the war. This is quite provocative in the face of Arab rapprochement and bringing Syria back into the Arab League, because it looks like the opposite is happening. So Iran and Saudi Arabia are arm wrestling over this. Will Syria eventually come back into the Arab camp, or is it going to remain very close to Iran? Ultimately, the Arabs have to accept this. And as Saudi Arabia has made peace with Iran, they're going to have to make peace with a Syria that is very influenced by Iran. And I think they're willing to do that. They're willing to do that because they do want to see reconstruction. They want to send refugees back to Syria. And the only way to do that is to rebuild Syria and make it rich enough and have enough jobs that Syrians will want to return home. And that's the real aim at the end of the day. They don't want foreign powers, Iran or Turkey, occupying parts of Syria. And the only way to do that is through Arab unity, economic strength, and to once again flex their muscle on the world stage and not be at each other's throats and in war constantly.
Arab unity and economic strength, I think that will ring a bell with many people living in the Arab world, not people from the outside telling them what to do. Professor John Gong, are we seeing something larger at play here, with regional actors pursuing dialogue and mutual peace? A more united Middle East could have far-reaching implications for the world. What are some of the potential outcomes of this trend, and how might they affect global politics and security?
Well, I think this is a broader trend, a more general trend that's very difficult to reverse. And I think atop of this, the Arab world certainly does want to play a much larger role in world politics. I think I can mention one example that Saudi Arabia is very interested in joining the BRICS bloc. That's a very significant development. And also other countries in the Arab world are probably more looking towards the UAE model, for example. It's a less, more of a secular society, and being a global trading center, and also shows its technological prowess even in some cutting edge technologies. I mean, this is something that hasn't been seen in the Arab world for quite some time, and now it's coming back, in my view.
It's a center of tourism and travel as well, no?
Glory the Arab world used to have. Exactly. Now, I do want to add a note I want to add a note about one thing. Reportedly, Antony Blinken, U.S. Secretary of State, and Jake Sullivan are going to visit Riyadh, actually, in the next few days. I do think that Washington probably will show some flexibility in dealing with the Syria issue as well as the Iran issue in general. I think Washington realizes that the old world is gone. The old world that Washington used to just come in and call the shot, that kind of a thing is gone now. I think Washington needs to, and I probably understands that, to show some flexibility in dealing with that part of the world. And I think I would expect to see some interesting results coming from the pending talks between the U.S. side and the Saudi side in just a few days.
Professor John Gong, as China increases its diplomatic initiatives in the Middle East, there is a growing concern in the West about its potential to, quote unquote, undermine U.S. regional influence. Some experts suggest that a Pax Sinica may be in the offering in the region. What is your view on this issue, and how do you see China's expanding role in the Middle East impacting regional dynamics?
Well, I think China has fundamentally a very different model here. I mean, if you look at what Washington has to offer in the Middle East, it's mostly, what Donald Trump used to describe as, these beautiful weapons, as he called it. You're talking about F-35, F-35, F-16, missiles, these kind of things. But what China brings to the table is overwhelmingly related to economic development. The Belt and Road Initiative, build. We build things. Whereas in the last 20 years, the United States has been bombing things everywhere. I mean, you think about this. I mean, the United States spent over $1 trillion, on this war in Iraq over how many years? I mean, this takes a long time. And during the same time, we here in China spend almost the same amount of money to build the state-of-the-art high-speed railway network, right? So, I think China's approach is fundamentally about build, versus America's approach used to be in the Middle East. It's all about bombing. So, I think that's the sharp difference here, and I think this is a difference that the Arab world sees very well, and something that they welcome.
It's a very eloquent way to put it, reminding me of your speech in Maryland where we first met, Professor John Gong. Very fond memories. Thank you. And thank you, Bobby and Professor Landis, for your time. And that would do it for this edition of The Hub on CGTN. Thank you so much for tuning in. Our news coverage continues on CGTN. Bye and take care.